Well, I'm just going to have a quick look at my game on Sunday from the 4NCL. My opponent was Jonathan Rogers, 2300 player, very dangerous player, so I was rather cautious in my opening choice against him. Sunday I've had in the past a very bad record. This might be something to do with a rather excessive bar intake on the Saturday night at the 4NCL. This last Saturday I was much more restrained, and I believe I was actually in bed by midnight, which may well be a first, and obviously this does help your chess. So in the game started, I was white, d4, d5, c4, and now my opponent played e5, which was rather a shock to me. And previously I had played some system with d takes e5, d4, e4, but I don't really believe this is much for white, and often I ended up struggling in somewhat passive positions. So after a 20-minute think already on move 2, really embarrassing, I shouldn't be thinking on move 2 what to play with the white pieces, I decided to just play the simple e3. Now I wasn't particularly happy, overjoyed with this move, because I realised my opponent could just play e takes d4, and I probably should take with a pawn, when we've actually reached a position you can get from the exchange French, which should be absolutely fine for white. For example, this position could have been reached after e4, e6, d4, d5, e takes d5, e takes d5, c4. So yeah, I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing that I wouldn't play necessarily with the white pieces. So my opponent, instead being the imaginative player that he is, played knight to c6, and we got a very interesting position. After my idea was just to develop quickly and get castled. So knight c3, knight to f3. On the other hand, my opponent was playing actively, pinning me, bishop e2, and now he grabbed the pawn on c4, which I think is critical and probably a good move here. I have to play sharply, so d5. Black can't move his knight on c6 anywhere because I have queen a4 check, winning the bishop, so he has to take on c3. And now after b takes c3, my opponent took on f3. I could take with the bishop here, which might be more sensible, but I didn't really see any kind of advantage after knight to e5, when the knight's threatening to come to d3. So if I just castle here, my opponent can also castle with something like knight to e7 and castles, and maybe even eliminate this bishop at some point, when my pawn on d5 could become a weakness. So I wasn't too keen on this. I thought tempo was the most important thing here, saving time. So actually, by playing this ugly pawn structure with g takes f3, I do gain time after knight to e5, because now knight to d3 is not such a strong threat. But my pawn structure is disgusting. I do have the two bishops against the two knights, but I've got to play very actively here. Otherwise, you know, if I just play passive moves, he's going to home in on my pawn weaknesses, and I am a pawn down as well. So bishop to a3, I saw this idea here, which was very interesting. I couldn't quite work out the consequences, but it looked dangerous for my opponent, so I dived into it. Bishop to a3, obviously this is a strong move. If he played something like knight to f6, because he can no longer castle, and his king will be subjected to a vicious attack. So knight to e7 was what I expected, what he played. Again, one more tempo. If he castles here, he's doing absolutely fine, so I've got to play with speed. So I played queen to d4. And now the point is, if he moves his knight on e5, then I just take on g7, and his king can no longer castle. So he has to really play queen takes d5, and now the point behind my play is bishop takes e7. If he takes on e7, I win the queen. If he takes on d4, well, then I can win a piece. So, I mean, I had a look at one variation here, knight c6, bishop c5, b6, d4, d5, when this should simply be winning for me. So my opponent has other moves. He even has strange moves like queen takes f3, which I looked at. Don't think that works. or knight takes f3. I was reasonably happy against both these options, but my opponent played the critical line, queen to e6 here, which is definitely a very good move. I mean, the point being, if I move my bishop on e7, very complicated position. Let's say I move my bishop back to a3. Well, this would be most embarrassing now, because knight takes f3 check wins my queen and the game. So again, I had to continue in the same vein and aim for quick development and aim to stop him from castling. So castle's queenside, the only option. Now king takes e7 is clearly inferior for him, because at some point I have a queen c5 check and f4, and his king is going to be open to a number of abusive checks. So queen takes e7 was the move he played. Again, speed is of the essence, so f4. I cannot allow him to castle, because then I'll just be 2 pawns down. Knight to g6, so that he can defend his rook after queen takes g7. And now I spent a lot of time thinking about f5 here. This may well be a very interesting possibility, but instead I dived into queen takes g7, when he can't take on e2 because he loses his queen, and I thought he had to play the move in the game, f6. He's actually defending very well so far, playing probably the best moves. I was looking at rook d8 here, but I thought in actual fact I could go, well, I have a number of strong moves here, but I thought rook on de1 was the most dangerous, when he can't avoid some nasty bishop discovered check or winning the queen. So my opponent plays f6. I mean, okay, I can take on e7, the position might be okay for me, but the most critical move is queen to h6. Again, I'm threatening some bishop move and rook e1 with a lot of pressure. It's all about keeping his king in the center here, and my opponent played the best move, queen to a3 check, king b1, queen takes c3, defending actively. And now he's threatening some perpetual check with some queen b4, queen a4, queen c4. So my last chance here to try to win is bishop takes c4. And if queen b4 check, I simply retreat bishop to b3. But after queen c4, I suddenly realized when I started this combination on move 11 with bishop to a3 and queen to d4. I mean, I suddenly looked at this kind of option here of queen's this position, but I thought I had some queen e6 check at a later moment, but I suddenly realized a bit earlier that this is no longer possible. For example, after rook on h to e1 check, I thought the game would probably end up a draw with knight to e5, and now originally I wanted to play rook takes e5, pawn takes e5, and queen to e6 check, which is an oversight because his queen is guarding this square. And I don't think I have anything better here than taking a draw. I mean, queen to h5 check doesn't work because king to f8, and if queen f5 check, he can defend with queen f7. So really there's nothing more than a draw. And I was absolutely amazed here when he played knight to e7, a shocking move and a massive blunder, when the win is fairly straightforward now. I just played rook takes e7 check, king takes e7, queen to g7 check. Now if king to e6, queen d7 is mate. If king here, e8, then I'm going to be winning after this. And okay, I don't take the rook on a8 because he has perpetual, but I keep checking him and mating probably eventually. My opponent now played queen to f7, and he was banking on me playing rook to d7 check, which will be a draw. But instead, I just played rook to e1 check, and he has to resign because he's losing a whole queen for nothing. So my opponent really cracked at the critical moment here after rook on h to e1 check. He moved a little bit too quickly. Had he spent another 5 minutes on the position, the game would have no doubt been a draw. So rather fortunate for me. Up to this point in the game, very interesting. Seemed to be actually fairly even and well played game. So a fairly fortunate win for me, but nonetheless a very interesting game. So again, please leave comments, and maybe I should learn some theory now. Cheers, bye.